Julian Vance was one of the richest men in the state, a titan of logistics who could move mountains of cargo across continents with a single phone call, but he couldn't move his own son from the silent, motionless prison of his mind. No amount of money could fix Leo. After firing 7 of the country's most expensive and credentialed caregivers, his hope had withered into a brittle, cynical shell. His sprawling mansion, a marvel of glass and steel perched on a cliff overlooking the city, felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a monument to a life he had built and a family he had lost. His wife, Eleanor, was gone, taken by a sudden illness 3 years prior, and his son, Leo, had followed her into a silence so profound it felt like a second death. The boy, only 7 years old, spent his days in a specialized wheelchair, his eyes vacant, his body limp, his small hand perpetually clenched around a worn, smooth wooden horse. He was a ghost in his own life, and Julian was the haunted zookeeper. Then a woman named Clara Mayhew arrived. She had none of the crisp, starched confidence of the others. She was quiet, unassuming, with a sorrow in her pale blue eyes that Julian recognized, a sorrow he saw in the mirror every morning. He hired her not out of hope, but out of the exhaustion of having no other options. She was the last name on a very long list. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Clara's first day was a study in observation. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, walked her through the rigid protocols. Leo's schedule was timed to the minute: feeding at 8, physical therapy at 10, sensory stimulation at 2, medication at 4. The rules were explicit. Do not deviate. Do not introduce unapproved stimuli. Do not, under any circumstances, show emotion that could be misinterpreted as pity. Mr. Vance insists on a professional clinical environment, Mrs. Gable stated, her voice as starched as her uniform. We are here to manage the condition, not to cure it. There is no cure. Clara nodded, her gaze drifting to the boy in the chair. He was staring at the blank wall, his expression unchanging. Everyone spoke about him in the third person, as if he were a piece of delicate, complicated furniture. His room was as sterile as a hospital's, painted a neutral beige, devoid of toys, pictures, or any trace of a child's life, save for the little wooden horse in his fist. Clara spent the day following the rules, her movements gentle and deliberate. She changed him, fed him the nutrient paste through a tube, assisted the stone-faced physical therapist in manipulating his limbs. Through it all, she watched him. She watched the subtle, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the horse, the faint flutter of his eyelashes. She saw not an empty vessel, but a locked room. That evening, after the day nurse had left and the house had settled into its deep, oppressive silence, Clara was tidying Leo's room. She folded his blankets, arranged the medical supplies, her motions creating a soft, rhythmic whisper in the quiet. On an impulse she didn't fully understand, born from a memory deep in her own past, she began to hum. It was a simple, half-forgotten lullaby, a tune her own mother used to sing. She wasn't humming to him, not really. It was for herself, a small comfort in the vast, lonely house. As the melody filled the space between them, she saw it. A flicker of movement. She stopped humming, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Leo's hand. His fingers, which had been locked in a death grip around the wooden horse, had tightened. It was a minuscule, spasmodic clench, a motion so small that anyone else would have missed it. But Clara saw it. It was a signal, a tiny spark in the crushing darkness. It was the first clue that everyone else was wrong. Clara knew that any deviation from the Vance household's rigid scripture would be grounds for immediate dismissal. Julian Vance was a man who commanded legions of employees and managed billions in assets. He would not tolerate a simple caregiver questioning the medical consensus surrounding his son, so she did not question it aloud. Instead, she began her own quiet, subtle campaign of unsanctioned therapy, a series of gentle experiments conducted in the shadows of the official schedule. She started with the light. The heavy blackout curtains in Leo's room were always kept drawn, creating a perpetual twilight that was meant to prevent overstimulation. The next morning, Clara pulled them open just an inch wider than the day before. A sliver of bright morning sun cut across the floor. She watched Leo from the corner of her eye. His gaze, usually fixed on the middle distance, seemed to drift for a moment toward the patch of light before returning to its vacant stare. It was enough. Each day she opened them a fraction more. Her next front was sound. The house was a temple of silence, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the soft tread of servants' shoes. Clara began to break that silence in small ways. She would let the door click shut instead of easing it closed. She would run the water in the sink a little longer, letting the sound of it fill the room, and she would hum her lullaby. She hummed it while she prepared his food, while she changed his linens, while she sat in the chair by his window during the mandated 2-hour quiet observation period. It was always the same tune, a simple, repetitive melody that became a thread connecting them. And each time she would see that same reaction, the infinitesimal tightening of his hand around the wooden horse. It was his only tell, his only signal to the outside world. And she was the only one listening. Julian Vance watched her, of course. His house was wired with more cameras than a casino. From his office, a cold, panoramic space that felt more like a control tower than a study, he would pull up the feed from Leo's room. He saw Clara talking to his son, not at him, like the nurses, who would announce procedures in a loud, clear voice, but to him. She would tell Leo about the weather, describe a fat robin she'd seen on the lawn, and recount the plot of a book she was reading. He saw her reading from a worn paperback copy of The Velveteen Rabbit, her voice a soft, even murmur. Julian felt a pang of something he quickly identified as irritation. It was sentimental foolishness. He paid her to be a caregiver, not a storyteller. Yet he didn't tell her to stop. Some part of him, a part he refused to acknowledge, was curious to see how long this new one would last before she, too, gave up. Clara's attention became fixed on the wooden horse. It was smooth from years of handling, its painted-on eyes and yarn tail long since worn away. The therapists had tried to take it from him, believing it to be a fixation that hindered progress. But Leo's grip was iron, and his distress, expressed through a slight increase in his heart rate on the monitor, had been palpable. Clara understood. The horse wasn't a hindrance. It was his anchor. It was the one thing in his world that was his. She never tried to take it. Instead, she sought to add to his world. One afternoon, she walked through the sprawling, immaculate gardens and found a small, perfectly smooth gray stone in one of the creek beds. She washed it and warmed it in her hands before placing it on the table beside Leo's wheelchair, just within his peripheral vision. Later that day, she saw his eyes flicker towards it, a brief, curious glance. The next day, she brought him a leaf, a brilliant red maple leaf from a tree near the greenhouse. She laid it next to the stone. He didn't react, but she felt a shift in the room's energy, a tiny crack in the vacuum. She was furnishing the locked room of his mind, one small, simple object at a time. She began to form a hypothesis, a dangerous, hopeful idea that went against everything the specialists and doctors had said. Leo wasn't gone. His senses weren't dormant. He was simply buried, trapped under a thick layer of silence, and she believed she had found the key. It wasn't in medicine or therapy. It was in a simple lullaby, a patch of sunlight, and a little wooden horse. The Vance mansion had a greenhouse. It was a beautiful Victorian structure of glass and wrought iron, tucked away at the far end of the west lawn. It had been Eleanor's sanctuary, but since her death it had fallen into a state of managed neglect. The gardeners kept the prize-winning roses alive, but the interior was a chaotic jungle of overgrown jasmine and dusty orchids. It was officially off-limits, another of Mrs. Gable's sternly delivered rules. "Mr. Vance does not like to be reminded," she had said, leaving the rest unsaid. To Clara, the greenhouse felt like the only living, breathing part of the entire estate. It was warm, humid, and smelled of damp earth and life. It was here she decided to take her biggest risk. During the afternoon sensory stimulation period, which usually consisted of a nurse brushing Leo's arms with different textured fabrics in his sterile room, Clara wheeled him down the long marble hallway through the kitchens and out a back service door. The journey felt illicit, a secret expedition into forbidden territory. The moment they entered the greenhouse, the atmosphere changed. The air was thick and sweet. Sunlight filtered through the dusty glass panes, created a dappled, golden light. Clara pushed his wheelchair down the narrow brick path, the wheels crunching softly on fallen leaves. She began to talk to him, her voice low. "This was your mother's favorite place, Leo," she said, though she had only gleaned this from a passing comment by one of the younger maids. "Look at this one." She stopped by a large fuzzy plant. "It's called a lamb's ear." She broke off a small leaf, its surface like soft gray velvet. She gently brushed it against the back of his hand. Nothing. She did it again, then touched his cheek with it. His skin didn't even twitch. For weeks, this became their secret ritual. Every afternoon she would wheel him to the greenhouse. She brought him flowers to smell, textured leaves to touch, and she described the vibrant colors of the orchids and bougainvillea. There was never a response, but Clara refused to be discouraged. She felt a rightness in being there, a sense that this place of life was a better healer than the dead silence of his room. One Tuesday afternoon, a storm was rolling in, the sky outside turning a bruised purple. Inside the greenhouse, the air was heavy and still. Clara was tending to a struggling orchid, misting its roots, when she began to hum her lullaby. The melody seemed to hang in the thick air, a fragile counterpoint to the distant rumble of thunder. She finished her task and turned back to Leo. And then it happened. A sound. It wasn't a word, not even a syllable. It was a low guttural hum that emanated from deep within his chest, a broken, off-key echo of her own tune. Clara froze, the misting bottle slipping from her fingers and clattering on the brick floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was almost afraid to look, terrified that she had imagined it. Slowly she turned her head. Leo's eyes, which for 3 years had been fixed on some point beyond the world, were on her. They were focused, and in their dark brown depths something shimmered, a glimmer of conscious awareness. "Leo," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She knelt in front of his wheelchair, her hands hovering in the air, afraid to touch him, afraid to break the spell. He made the sound again, a little louder this time, his throat vibrating with the effort. A tear escaped Clara's eye and traced a hot path down her cheek. It was the first voluntary sound he had made since the day his mother died. It was hope, made audible. It was everything. Julian Vance's day had been a catastrophe. A multi-billion-dollar shipping deal had imploded at the last minute due to a geopolitical spat halfway around the world. He had spent 8 hours in brutal back-to-back video calls, his temper fraying with each passing minute. He left the city office in a foul mood, the frustration and pressure coiling in his gut like a serpent. He drove home too fast, the sleek engine of his car a poor substitute for the release he needed. He wanted only the cold, predictable silence of his house. As he strode through the grand, echoing foyer, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The silence was not complete. From the west wing, he could hear a faint sound, a melodic, repetitive humming. Annoyance, sharp and hot, flared in his chest. Had he not made his rules perfectly clear? He followed the sound, his expensive shoes clicking angrily on the marble floors. It led him down a corridor he hadn't walked in years, toward the back of the house, toward the one place he had forbidden all staff from entering, the greenhouse. He pushed the heavy door open, ready to unleash a torrent of fury on whichever staff member had dared to disobey him. But the words died in his throat. The sight before him defied all logic, all expectation. There in the middle of the verdant chaos was Clara Mayhew. She was kneeling on the brick floor in front of Leo's wheelchair, and she was singing. That was shocking enough, but it was Leo who shattered Julian's reality. His son, his silent, motionless son, was humming. It was a broken, fragile sound, a reedy and uncertain harmony. But it was undeniably his. His head was lifted slightly off the headrest, and his eyes were fixed on Clara's face with an intensity Julian hadn't seen in years. For a long, frozen moment, Julian could only stare, his mind struggling to process the scene. This was impossible. The doctors, the specialists, the experts, they had all been clear. Leo was gone, locked away in a place no one could reach. Yet here he was, humming. Then the years of disappointment, of false hopes, and cynical resignation slammed back into place like a steel door. This had to be a trick, a performance. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared, his voice bouncing off the glass panes of the greenhouse. The spell was broken. Clara jumped, startled, her song cutting off abruptly. Leo flinched as if struck, his head dropping back against the headrest, his eyes going vacant again. The light was extinguished. He retreated back into his silent shell, the transformation so sudden and complete it was terrifying. Julian advanced on them, his face a mask of thunderous rage. "I gave you specific instructions. No unauthorized activities, no emotional manipulation. What is this, some kind of sideshow you're putting on?" His voice was laced with the venom of 1,000 disappointments. He pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "You're fired. Get out of my house. Now!" Clara scrambled to her feet, her own fear eclipsed by a surge of protective fire for the boy who had just been snatched back from the world. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You don't understand. He was responding. He was humming with me. He was connecting." "Connecting?" Julian scoffed, the sound harsh and ugly. "He is incapable of connecting. You're projecting, seeing what you want to see. I will not have my son be a part of your sentimental delusions." He reached for the handles of Leo's wheelchair, intending to wheel him away, to restore the cold, miserable order he understood. But as he did, Leo did something impossible, something that defied 3 years of medical certainty. He slowly, deliberately lifted his right hand, the one not clutching the little wooden horse. With a visible, trembling effort, he extended it, his small fingers uncurling, and he brushed his fingertips against Clara's arm. Julian froze. His hand fell away from the wheelchair. He stared at his son's hand, at the point of contact with this woman he had just fired. It was the first time Leo had initiated physical contact with another human being since Eleanor's funeral. The first time. The anger drained out of Julian in a sudden dizzying rush, leaving behind a hollow space filled with a terrifying, bewildering flicker of hope. He looked from his son's hand to Clara's face, then back again. He saw the tears shimmering in her eyes, but also a fierce certainty. She was right. He was wrong. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and the certainty from his world. He didn't know how to apologize. The words were foreign to him. But he didn't have to. The evidence was right there, his small son's hand resting on the arm of the caregiver. He straightened up, the master of a universe that had just been turned upside down. His voice, when it came, was rough, stripped of its earlier fury. "Explain," was all he said. The old order was broken. A new, fragile, and terrifying alliance had just been born. The investigation began in a place that epitomized Julian's life, the archive room. It was a climate-controlled, windowless vault in the sub-basement of the mansion, filled with rows of sterile, white filing cabinets. Here, every aspect of the Vance empire and the Vance family was documented, categorized and stored. Julian, moving with a stiff, uncharacteristic uncertainty, granted Clara access to everything pertaining to Leo. He sat with her at a large sterile table, a silent, watchful presence as she began to sift through the mountain of paper that constituted his son's life. For hours they worked under the cold, fluorescent lights. Clara's focus was absolute. She read every doctor's report, every therapist's evaluation, every nurse's log. The narrative was crushingly consistent. The official diagnosis, signed and re-signed on dozens of documents by Dr. Alistair Finch, was profound post-traumatic catatonia. The prognosis, repeated like a mantra, was poor to grave. The notes described a boy who was non-responsive, who showed no cognitive awareness, who was, for all intents and purposes, a shell. "This isn't him," Clara said softly, pushing a file away. "The boy in these papers is not the boy in the greenhouse." Julian didn't respond, but he leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents she indicated. He still held a deep, instinctual trust in Dr. Finch. Alistair had been more than a doctor. He had been a friend, a confidant to Eleanor, a pillar of support during the horrifying weeks of her illness. To question him felt like a betrayal of his wife's memory. "Alistair is the best pediatric neurologist on the continent," Julian stated, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "He's exhausted every possible treatment." Clara didn't argue. Instead, she picked up a different set of documents, his late wife Eleanor's journals. She had found them tucked away in a box labeled Personal Effects. She opened one to a bookmarked page. "Can you read this entry?" she asked. Julian took the leather-bound book. Eleanor's elegant script filled the page. The entry was dated 2 months after her own terminal diagnosis, a month after Leo had begun to seriously withdraw. It read, "Leo is so quiet today. It breaks my heart. Alistair started the new protocol this morning, a new medication. He says it's experimental, but that it will help Leo rest, protect his mind from the trauma of it all. I pray he's right. I need him to be right." Clara had already cross-referenced the date. It was the exact week that the nurse's logs showed Leo's regression had accelerated dramatically, the week he had stopped speaking altogether. Julian felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He started flipping through the journal. Entry after entry mentioned the new protocol and Dr. Finch's reassurances. Each mention coincided with a new, deeper level of his son's retreat from the world. "It's a coincidence," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Clara then directed him to a projector and a stack of data discs. They were home videos. For the next hour, they watched Leo's life in reverse. They saw a giggling, vibrant 4-year-old chasing a ball on the lawn, his face bright with joy. They saw a slightly more subdued 5-year-old after Eleanor's diagnosis, but he was still present, still interacting. Then they watched the videos from after the new protocol began. The change was stark and horrifying. Leo was lethargic, his movements slow, his eyes glazed. He looked like a different child entirely. It was like watching a light being slowly, systematically dimmed. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when Clara, searching through a box of financial records for the family's charitable foundation, found a thick stack of invoices. They were from a private boutique pharmaceutical lab Julian had never heard of, a company called Neurogen Solutions. The invoices were for a single recurring charge, billed monthly to the foundation and personally authorized by Dr. Alistair Finch. The charges were astronomical, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. The line item was for a drug with a long, complex chemical name. Its description read NGS-7, Experimental Neurological Stabilizer. Clara looked at Julian, her expression grim. "The foundation is paying for his medicine." Julian stared at the invoice, at the signature of the man he had trusted with his wife's life and his son's future. The cold knot in his stomach tightened into a block of ice. He picked up his phone, his movements precise and deadly calm. He was going to find out what NGS-7 was, and he was going to use every ounce of his power to do it. The quiet investigation was over. A war was about to begin. Julian Vance did not make requests. He made demands. He called Marcus Thorne, the CEO of a rival biotech conglomerate, a man with whom he shared a healthy and profitable animosity. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice devoid of pleasantries, "I'm sending a sample to your lab. I need a full discrete workup. I want to know what it is, what it does, and who makes it. I need it in 48 hours. Name your price." There was a pause, and then Thorne, recognizing the sound of a wounded predator in Julian's voice, simply said, "No charge. Consider it a professional courtesy." The next day, Julian arranged for one of Leo's blood samples, routinely taken by the night nurse, to be rerouted to Thorne's lab instead of the one designated by Dr. Finch. The waiting was agony. Julian locked himself in his office, the security camera feed of Leo's room playing on a large monitor. He watched as Clara went about her day, her every interaction with Leo now imbued with a new, desperate significance. He saw her take him to the greenhouse, saw her sing to him, saw the almost imperceptible turn of Leo's head in her direction. He was seeing the truth with his own eyes, but he needed the science to confirm the betrayal. The call from Marcus Thorne came 36 hours later, well ahead of schedule. "Julian," Thorne's voice was grave, "are you sitting down?" "Just tell me," Julian bit out, "the compound in your son's blood, what you're calling NGS-7, it's not a neurological stabilizer. It's the opposite. It's a custom-synthesized psychoactive sedative, extremely potent. We've never seen this exact molecule, but its closest cousins are powerful dissociatives, drugs used in research to induce a temporary catatonic state in lab animals." The line went silent for a moment. The world in Julian's office seemed to tilt on its axis. "It suppresses higher cognitive function, motor control, emotional response. Julian, this drug isn't treating a condition, it's causing the symptoms." The phone felt slick in Julian's hand. He felt a wave of nausea so profound he had to grip the edge of his desk. Poison. For 3 years, Alistair Finch, the man he had trusted, the man who had eulogized his wife, had been systematically poisoning his son. The motive, when it was uncovered, was as sickeningly simple as it was evil. While waiting for the lab results, Julian had sicked his most ruthless forensic accountants on the Vance Family Foundation's books, with a specific focus on any project involving Dr. Finch. The report came in an hour after Thorne's call. It was all there, laid out in cold, hard numbers. Dr. Finch was the sole director of a research initiative funded by the Foundation to study rare pediatric neurological disorders. He had been funneling millions of dollars in grants to a shell corporation. That shell corporation was the sole owner of a private lab named Neurogen Solutions. Finch had created a disease in Leo, then created a foundation initiative to cure it, and was using that initiative to pay himself millions of dollars for the very drug that was causing the illness. He hadn't just betrayed Julian, he had turned his son into a lab rat, a living, breathing prop for the most monstrous fraud imaginable. The grief Julian had carried for 3 years, a heavy, suffocating blanket, was burned away in an instant, replaced by a rage so pure and so cold it felt like a physical force. He looked at the monitor, at his pale, still son, and he made a vow. Alistair Finch would not just be ruined, he would be erased. But Dr. Alistair Finch was a snake who had been living in Julian's garden for a very long time. He had woven his influence deep into the fabric of the Vance family and its charitable foundation. He had friends on the board, loyalties he had cultivated for years. Through one of these contacts, a whisper reached him. Julian Vance was making inquiries. He was asking questions about Neurogen Solutions. Finch understood immediately that his lucrative deception was on the verge of collapse. He didn't panic. He was a man who planned for contingencies. He moved with the calculated, brutal speed of a surgeon excising a threat. He knew he couldn't discredit Julian directly, but he could discredit his catalyst. He could discredit Clara. Before Julian could even marshal his lawyers, Finch struck. He called an emergency, closed-door meeting of the Foundation's board of directors. He arrived looking grave and deeply concerned, and he presented them with a meticulously fabricated dossier on Clara Mayhew. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. He painted her as a cunning grifter, a predator with a history of targeting vulnerable, wealthy families. He included falsified records, fake testimonies from non-existent former employers. He twisted her gentle, patient methods into something sinister. He presented them with a video. It was security footage from Leo's room, but it was cleverly and maliciously edited. A clip of Clara gently repositioning Leo in his chair was cut and looped to look like she was shaking him roughly. A moment where she wiped a tear from her own eye was framed to look like she was mocking the child. It was sickeningly effective. "She has been emotionally manipulating the boy," Finch explained to the horrified board members, his voice dripping with false empathy, "creating these so-called responses to insinuate herself further into Mr. Vance's life, likely for financial gain. Julian, in his grief, is blind to it. I fear for the child's safety." To complete his trap, he executed his cruelest move. He knew from Eleanor that she kept a small, exquisite diamond necklace, a gift from Julian, in a velvet box in her old dressing room. Finch retrieved it and, using a master key, planted it in the bottom of Clara's suitcase in her modest staff quarters. The trap was set. He arrived at the mansion the next morning, flanked by 2 police officers and a Child Protective Services agent. He presented himself as the concerned family physician, forced to take this drastic step. Julian, still reeling from the revelations about the medication, was caught completely off guard. His mind was a maelstrom of rage and betrayal, his judgment clouded. Finch played on his deepest insecurities, his grief, his guilt. "I tried to warn you, Julian," Finch said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "These people, they see your tragedy as an opportunity. I'm so sorry." When the police searched Clara's room and produced the stolen necklace, Julian's world fractured. For a terrible, confused moment, the old doctor's deception felt more real than the new, monstrous truth. Could he have been wrong about Clara, too? Had it all been a lie? In that moment of weakness and confusion, Julian froze. He just watched, his face a stone mask, as they let a stunned and protesting Clara out of his house. He saw the look of utter shock and betrayal in her eyes as they put her in the back of the police car. The next day, a restraining order was delivered, filed by Dr. Finch on behalf of the Vance estate, barring her from coming within 500 feet of Leo. Dr. Finch had successfully cut her off, reasserting his absolute control. The news reported the story as a sad but simple case. A thieving caregiver caught preying on a grieving family. Clara was alone, penniless, and facing the full weight of a legal system manipulated by a monster. The effect of Clara's absence on Leo was immediate and catastrophic. The small, fragile flame of awareness she had so patiently coaxed into being was instantly extinguished. Dr. Finch, now with sole authority over Leo's care, immediately doubled the dosage of NGS-7 under the guise of stabilizing him after the trauma of his abuse. The boy who had hummed in the greenhouse, who had reached out his hand, vanished. In his place was a child more still, more silent, more absent than ever before. He stopped responding to any stimuli. He began refusing food, his body rejecting the nutrient paste until the nurses had to use a more invasive feeding tube. The light in his eyes, which had just begun to return, was gone, leaving only a dull, vacant blackness. He was a ghost again. This was the sight that finally, irrevocably, shattered Julian's paralysis. Standing over his son's bed, seeing the horrifying regression, he knew with a chilling, soul-deep certainty that he had made a monstrous, unforgivable mistake. The image of Clara's face, her eyes wide with betrayal as the police car pulled away, burned in his mind. The rage he felt toward Finch returned, 1,000 times stronger, but now it was alloyed with a profound self-loathing. He had let it happen. He had let the snake back into the garden. In that moment, the cold, detached titan of industry died, and the protective father was born. He shed the last vestiges of his grief-stricken inertia and became a force of nature. He picked up the phone and unleashed the full, terrifying power of his wealth and influence. He hired not just one legal team, but 3. The first was tasked with Clara's defense, the second with building a criminal case against Finch, and the third, a pack of corporate sharks, was ordered to financially dismantle Finch, his shell corporations, and any institution that had ever been complicit with him. His investigators worked around the clock, flying across the country, digging into every corner of Alistair Finch's life. They found a pattern. They found other wealthy long-term patients with rare, incurable conditions. They found a trail of financial misconduct, of inflated billing and questionable research grants, stretching back a decade. While the legal machine began to grind, Julian focused on Leo. He fired the entire medical staff Finch had installed. He sat by his son's bed for hours, talking to him, reading to him. He took Leo to the greenhouse and, his voice awkward and rough, he tried to sing the lullaby he'd heard Clara sing, but there was no response. Leo remained locked away. Julian realized, with a despairing heart, that he was missing the key. He could provide resources, protection, and fury, but he couldn't provide the one thing Leo needed, the genuine, unconditional patient connection he had shared with Clara. The trial against Clara was being fast-tracked. The district attorney, spurred on by the influential Dr. Finch and the media narrative he had crafted, saw it as a slam-dunk case. Julian's lawyers, attempting to introduce the complex evidence of the medication and the financial fraud into a simple theft trial, were stonewalled by the judge at every turn. It was deemed irrelevant to the matter at hand. The confrontation was set for the courtroom, and Julian knew that all the evidence his teams were gathering would be useless if Clara was convicted first. A conviction would destroy her credibility and validate Finch's entire narrative. Julian looked at his silent, fading son and knew with a gambler's terrifying certainty that the only person who could truly testify to Clara's character, the only witness who could cut through the lies, was the one person in the world who supposedly couldn't speak. The courtroom was a suffocating box of dark wood and fluorescent light. Clara Mayhew stood beside a weary, court-appointed public defender who had already advised her, in a hushed and pitying tone, to accept a plea bargain. She looked small, pale, and utterly defeated, a ghost at her own execution. In the front row of the gallery, Dr. Alistair Finch sat with a mask of somber concern, the very picture of a virtuous man forced to perform an unpleasant duty. The prosecutor, a sharp, ambitious young man, was methodically and efficiently building a cage of circumstantial evidence around Clara. He presented the stolen necklace in a plastic bag. He played the maliciously edited security footage on a large screen, the jury gasping at the sight of what looked like a rough shake. He called Mrs. Gable to the stand, who testified that Clara was secretive and often broke house rules. It was damning, a slow public strangulation of her character. Julian's lead attorney, a formidable woman named Evelyn Davies, could do little more than object on procedural grounds, each objection overruled by the impatient judge. During a brief recess, Julian made a decision that sent a shockwave of panic through his legal team. "I'm bringing him here," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Julian, you can't," Davies hissed. "It's a circus. The judge will have you thrown out for contempt. It will prejudice the jury against her, not for her." "Leo is the only witness that matters," Julian replied, his eyes fixed on Clara as she was led back to the defendant's table. "It's the only move I have left." Against the frantic advice of his entire team, he left the courthouse. He returned 20 minutes later, just as the afternoon session was resuming. He pushed Leo's wheelchair into the back of the courtroom himself, the quiet whir of its electric motor an intrusion in the tense silence. The prosecutor called his final witness, Clara Mayhew. Her testimony was a disaster. Her voice was so soft it was barely audible. Her honest, simple account of humming lullabies and taking Leo to the greenhouse sounded like a fanciful, desperate lie in the face of the prosecutor's sharp, cynical questioning. He moved in for the kill. "Isn't it true, Ms. Mayhew, that you saw a grieving, wealthy man and his sick son, and you concocted a scheme to manipulate them for your own financial gain?" Before Clara could answer, a commotion erupted from the back of the room. Leo, who had been sitting listlessly, suddenly became agitated. Seeing Clara on the stand, hearing the prosecutor's venomous tone, something broke through the chemical fog. He began to struggle against the straps of his wheelchair, a low, frustrated groan escaping his lips. Every head in the courtroom turned. The judge banged his gavel. "Mr. Vance, control your son, or I will have him removed." But Julian ignored him. He began to push the wheelchair down the center aisle. Dr. Finch leaped to his feet, his face a mask of alarm. "He's having a seizure. The boy is unstable. She is causing this." He started moving toward Leo, pulling a pre-filled syringe from his pocket. "He needs his medication. Let me through." But before Finch could reach him, Julian brought the wheelchair to a stop right in front of the witness box. Leo's entire body was straining. He looked past Julian, his eyes locking on Clara's. For a moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to the space between the broken boy and the betrayed woman. With a monumental effort that seemed to consume every ounce of his being, he lifted his left hand, the one that had held the wooden horse for 3 years. He opened his small, stiff fingers, and for the first time since his mother's death, he let the horse go. It clattered onto the polished courtroom floor, the sound as loud as a gunshot in the stunned silence. Then, his hand still raised, he pointed a single, trembling finger, not at Clara, straight at Dr. Alistair Finch. And from his throat came one clear, rasping, world-changing word. "Bad." The courtroom fell into a silence so profound it was deafening. The single word, from the boy everyone knew was silent, from the victim everyone thought was oblivious, was an irrefutable testament. It was the truth, delivered in its purest form. It shattered Finch's credibility, his lies, his entire persona in an instant. Evelyn Davies, seizing the moment of stunned chaos, strode forward and slammed a file onto the prosecutor's table. "Your Honor," she announced, her voice ringing with triumph, "in light of this new testimony, we have some additional evidence we believe the court will now find highly relevant." The case against Clara Mayhew was over. The case against Dr. Alistair Finch was just beginning. 2 years later, the Vance mansion was no longer a mausoleum. It was a home. The heavy, sound-dampening curtains were gone, replaced with light, airy fabrics that allowed sunlight to stream into every room. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the sounds of life, the distant notes of a piano being played, the occasional burst of laughter from the gardens, the whir of an electric train set in the grand ballroom. The sterile beige walls of the West Wing were now a riot of color, covered floor to ceiling in the vibrant, joyful, and wonderfully messy paintings of a young boy discovering his imagination. Dr. Alistair Finch was serving a 30-year prison sentence for a litany of crimes, including felony fraud, child endangerment, and practicing medicine without a conscience. The Vance Family Foundation had been gutted and rebuilt from the ground up under Clara's guidance. It was now a leading and fiercely transparent international advocate for patients' rights, dedicated to exposing medical fraud and protecting the vulnerable. The final scene of their old life's demolition and the first of their new one's construction took place on a warm summer evening. A charity gala was being held in the mansion's gardens to celebrate the foundation's 2nd anniversary. Julian Vance stood at a podium, not in his usual armor of a dark business suit, but in a relaxed tuxedo, his face open and smiling. He was no longer the cold, haunted titan of industry. He was a man remade by love and a terrible, clarifying truth. Clara stood beside him, her hand resting in his, her quiet strength now a source of radiant confidence. Between them stood Leo, a bright and talkative 9-year-old looking dapper in a miniature tuxedo. In his hand he held the small wooden horse, no longer a shield against the world, but a cherished memento of a journey completed. Julian spoke to the crowd of supporters and journalists, his voice steady and filled with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He didn't speak of quarterly earnings or logistical triumphs. He told the story of his family. He spoke of his own blindness, his grief, and his profound error. And then he spoke of Clara. "There are people who come into your life who don't just change it. They restore it," he said, turning to look at her, the love in his eyes clear for all to see. "They are the quiet observers, the ones who listen when the world is shouting, who see the person hidden behind the diagnosis. Clara was the woman who listened when my son was silent, and in doing so, she taught me how to hear him too." The applause was thunderous. Later that evening, as the party wound down and the lanterns in the garden cast a warm, golden glow, the three of them walked by the large stone fountain. Leo, who had been chattering excitedly about the chocolate dessert, suddenly grew quiet and thoughtful. He stopped and looked up at the two adults who had become his world. "You know," he said, holding up the wooden horse, "it's not just wood. It has memories in it, sad ones from before, and happy ones now." Julian knelt and pulled his son into a hug, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Over Leo's shoulder he met Clara's gaze. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. They were a family, not a family of perfect people, but a family forged in crisis, bound by a shared fight for truth, and healed by the quiet, persistent, and unconquerable power of love. The world had dealt them its worst, and together they had built something beautiful from the wreckage. True wealth, Julian finally understood, wasn't about what you could buy, but what you would fight to protect. Before we sign off, remember to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed the story. And we'd love to hear from you, so please drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from.